still Mary Brabeck, and I'm still Dean of the Carolyn A. and Peter S. Lynch School of Education at Boston College. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight. In the late 50s, early 60s, I attended St. Mark's Parish School in St. I attended a Catholic girls' school for women, a girls' school called Convent of the Visitation. And I learned from the playground talk about the prohibitions made famous by Catholic authors like Mary Gordon and Trish Hampel. Did you hear any of these stories? Did you hear about the patent leather shoes? Girls, don't wear patent leather shoes because it might reflect up your skirts. Don't go to restaurants where there's white linen on the table. Tablecloths might remind a boy of bed linen. And my favorite, if you travel in a group with other friends and you're driving somewhere by car, then bring a telephone book in case you have to sit on a boy's lap. I think that could be the origin of the backpack, I think. Sexuality, what a puzzle it is. What a puzzle it was for Catholic girls. And then as a young married woman in the wake of Vatican II, and then, of course, Humanae Vitae, and does one's conscience trump the rules, or is it the other way around? What is contemporary Catholic thinking about human sexuality, about the purpose of sexuality, and what does the Church really teach? Fortunately, at Boston College, a Catholic university, we have the resources to think about these questions. And we have tonight 3 scholars whose professional lives have been devoted to thinking about questions of ethics, contemporary values, and sexuality within the Christian tradition. It's not the playground talk you'll hear tonight. Tonight is an introduction to the large topic of sexuality and the Christian tradition. Our aim is to look at the rich tradition of Catholic teaching on sexuality. Subsequent sessions over the next couple of months will take on different topics of this, or different aspects of this topic. And I want to refer to this publication that's available to you that updates you on all of, or many of the sessions that are being held here at Boston College under the Church in the 21st Century effort. And in particular, I want to call your attention to the next 3 sessions on the topic of sexuality within the Christian tradition. The first is Why Get Married? That's Thursday, March 20th, and there's an error in your program. The actual session will be in the Heights room of the lower campus dining hall. That's on March 20th. It's not Devlin Hall, it's the Heights room. And on March 25th, we will take up the topic, Why Celibacy? From the Hindu, Buddhist, and Christian perspectives. And that's Tuesday, March 25th at 7 o'clock in the Welch dining room. And the third and final topical session following the other 2 is homosexuality in a Catholic context. What has been said about it, what else can be said? And that will be Monday, April 28th, right here in Robsham. My introduction to the speakers tonight will be brief, because if I told you all their accomplishments, there wouldn't be time for them to talk. And besides, we have 3 speakers tonight who are such good citizens of this university that they are likely well known to you already. Our first speaker is Father Michael Himes. Father Himes received his PhD in the history of Christianity from the University of Chicago. He has published, edited, or translated 8 books and over 40 scholarly papers, and has produced a series of videotapes on issues of faith and the Christian tradition. And Father Himes, as students tonight will attest, is sought after as a public speaker at learned societies, professional organizations, international conferences, universities throughout the United States and abroad, and on our own campus. He has spoken on topics as diverse as grace and sacramental life, religion and human rights, rethinking the doctrine of God, racism, a theological perspective, and reasons for hope within the culture and the Church. Let's welcome Father Himes.
Thank you very much, Dean Brabeck, and thank you very much for being here this evening. I look forward to this. I must confess, with a certain amount of amusement, the idea of my speaking to an audience about sexuality leads me to suspect that next week I will be invited by the Carroll School of Management to speak about developing your stock portfolio, since I know as much about the one as I do about the other. What I intend to do this evening is to lay some foundation for what my colleagues are going to be saying about the issue of sexuality in the whole of the Catholic tradition. And I want to lay those foundations very deeply indeed. To do it, I'm going to ask you to think with me about the first chapter of Genesis. As I said, this would be deep foundations. Many times the fathers of the church, those great theologians of the first 6 or 7 centuries of the church's life, turned to the first chapter of Genesis, specifically to the account of God's action on the 6th day of creation in creating the first human beings. They turned to that as an indication of the doctrine of the Trinity. Let us make the human being in our image and likeness. One father after the other said. Notice the plural. God speaks of our image and likeness. This is the first hint of the triune character of God in the Christian tradition. I must confess, I think that makes the pronoun carry an awful lot of theological weight. I'm not sure I'd be willing to put that much weight on the second person plural, second person pronoun. But I do think there is, in fact, a first echo of what the Christian tradition will insist is true of God in the Trinity in that text in Genesis. Let us make the human being in our image and likeness. And therefore, the text says, a very interesting word, and therefore, for that reason, what reason? To be in the image and likeness of God. And therefore, male and female, God created them. So that Genesis 1 seems to be saying that being gendered says something about how we image God. Now, I certainly don't suggest to you that God is bisexual or that God is ambiguous in sexuality. I don't mean that, of course, at all, and neither does Scripture. I suggest to you the point is this, that in the Hebrew tradition, God is always the God of someone or somewhere. The God of Abraham and Sarah. The God of Isaac and Rebekah and Rachel. The God of Jacob and Leah. That God is the God of Moses, the God of Israel. God is always God in relationship. That this is, we're not talking about the unmoved mover of Aristotle. We're not talking about a God who exists in splendid isolation. That God is always engaged in relationship. And that apart from relationship, one cannot speak of God at all. Now, I suggest to you that it's in that context that the Hebrew scriptures understand sexuality. Why are human beings gendered? Because it is the most obvious, the unmistakable, the undeniable indication that we are made to be in relationship to one another. And it is our ability to enter into relationship with one another that is the way we are the image and likeness of God. The New Testament, of course, is going to say that in the most profound way when it insists that the least raw way of understanding God is as a particular kind of relationship, agapic love, that God is agape. So that apart from relationality, one will always misunderstand who God is. One will not understand what one means by the word God, except in a relational context. So that from the very beginning of Genesis, sexuality and relationality are closely linked. But there's another link in Genesis. I wonder if you notice, we've heard those stories, the great mythic stories in Genesis of the creation. We've heard it so often that we sometimes miss some of its power. You notice, when God wants to populate the waters, he says, let there be the fish and the great monsters of the deep. And immediately Scripture tells us the waters teemed with life. God didn't create the first two fish, and then they bring about life elsewhere. God fills the seas with life. God fills the air with birds. God fills the earth with animals and plants. But God doesn't fill the earth with human beings. God creates just two, male and female, and tells them, now you increase and multiply and fill the whole earth. So that if we are in the image and likeness of God, what is, apart from relationality, the first thing we know about God in the Old Testament? Up to that moment in Genesis 1, what is the one thing we know God does? And the answer is, God creates. So that if we are made in the image and likeness of God, then, unsurprisingly, we are made to be creative. So God does not fill the earth with human beings. God creates the first two human beings and tells them, now you fill the earth with human beings. That from the very beginning, sexuality is both relational and procreative. That it both mirrors God's being relational. Ultimately, the tradition will talk of that in terms of the doctrine of the Trinity. And it mirrors the fact that God is creative in our procreativity. So from the very beginning, the whole of the scriptural tradition, the whole of the Hebrew tradition, wants to insist on the enormous goodness of sexuality. There is no hesitation in Scripture on embracing sex as a great God-given good. It is an echo of who God is in that it tells us we are relational and that we are creative, as God is relational and God is creative. In fact, one of the things that's most surprising about the gospel in relation to all of this is that the gospel says so little about sexuality. If one were to ask, what was Jesus teaching on sexuality? The answer would be precious little. Jesus really doesn't say much about sexuality. He certainly does talk about the importance of marriage, although he relativizes the importance of marriage. On the one hand, marriage is so important that when two people are joined together, they become one flesh, and they must not be separated. You cannot write a bill of divorcement, he insists to the scribes and the Pharisees. On the other hand, in the kingdom of heaven, they neither give nor take in marriage. And he has come to separate people, he tells his hearers. I remember some years ago, my brother, who teaches social ethics in Washington, as I always say, isn't that a description of a failure? Teaching social ethics. Like teaching table etiquette in the Shark Tank. Some years ago, Kenneth and I were teaching a summer course together here in BC. And one of the people in the course said in a question directed to my brother, isn't it true that the church has always stood for family values? That family values are central to the gospel? And Kenneth said, well, yes and no. I mean, obviously, yes, in many ways. But on the other hand, a tradition whose founder begins by saying, anyone who loves husband or wife, father or mother, child, brother or sister more than me, is unworthy of me is scarcely giving an absolutely unqualified endorsement to family values. So that Jesus' teaching is not very great on sexuality. It's about marriage. It insists on the good of marriage, but also insists that it's a relative good. It's not an absolute good. Apart from that, Jesus says precious little about sexuality at all. Why does it become so central in the life of the church? I suggest to you for a very important reason that we sometimes tend to forget. And that is that when Christianity emerged into the ancient Greek and Roman world in the first century of the Common Era, it was one of a lot of new religious movements that were emerging from the eastern end of the Roman Empire. Many of those other movements we lumped together under a kind of umbrella term, Gnosticism. But in fact, Christianity had to work very carefully to distinguish itself from many other traditions that we now refer to as Gnosticism. And in much of Gnosticism, sexuality was an immensely important issue. Indeed, sometimes in contradictory ways. I often like to describe this as, for ease and convenience, left-wing and right-wing Gnosticism. The one thing that is true about all of the Gnostics is that they're dualists. There is a great difference between the spirit and the flesh, between the soul and the body, a great divorce. Right-wing Gnostics tended to be groups that said, yes, the divorce is so deep, so thorough, that in fact you have to try and separate the spirit from the flesh. So that sexual intercourse ending